شیدا ونس هستم از واشنگتن و وکیل هستم. Had one case in particular of a man. He was a father and he had a small son who was about 2 years old. And they came into the office. The father came with the son, and before he even told me his story, he took off his son's shirt to show me something. And I was like, what's going on? And his son, you could see, had a major issue with his stomach. He had had surgery as an infant and it hadn't properly been closed, and that was continuing to cause him problems as a toddler. And so all this man wanted was some kind of access to medical care. And so I spent months with this family trying to get them some kind of medical assistance, and they're just constant roadblocks because he was a refugee. He was from Sudan. And that also it really made me understand that where you're born can have such a huge impact on what you have access to, but where you're born is not something you have any control over, right? So it's not, how is it fair that just because you were born on this side of a border versus the other side, your child should die early because he can't get access to healthcare, right? There's something very wrong, I think, with that being the reality of our current society. I'm 30 years old. And I grew up in a Baha'i family. My mother is from Iran originally, and my father is African American. I was born in Boston in the United States, but when I was only 2 years old, my parents decided to move to the Ivory Coast. And part of the reason for their move is because they wanted to serve the Baha'i community there. So we lived in the Ivory Coast for a few years, and then Kenya, and then Botswana, and then Egypt, where I finished high school. And all of these moves were for my parents. The purpose was to serve the Baha'i community. So when we were growing up, for my brother and I, it was very important in our family that service be a component of our lives. Every home that we lived in was always open to anyone. I remember coming home from school and there might be a new person staying in our guest room, might be a new family. People would stay for a month to 6 months to longer. So that was a big component of our lives. And that's something that as an adult I've tried to carry forward with my home as well. After high school, I decided to do a year of service. And so I spent a year between two Baha'i institutes in the United States, one at the Native American Baha'i Institute, which is in Arizona on the Navajo Reservation, and then some time at the Lewis Gregory Baha'i Institute in South Carolina. And that was a wonderful experience, I think, for me to really learn how the Baha'i community is working in these areas that don't get a lot of attention, I think, from the rest of the United States. So I did that for 1 year, and then I started my undergraduate degree at Harvard. So I went back to Boston, where I was born, to Cambridge, right next to Boston, and I did my 4-year bachelor's degree there in social studies. After that, I took a year off and I went back to Cairo, which is where I had graduated from high school. And I had become very interested through college and also high school in women's issues, right? And in particular, Egypt, there's a huge problem with female circumcision. 97% of the women in Egypt are circumcised. And that's an issue that I found very interesting, and I didn't fully understand why the numbers were still so high. So I wrote my senior thesis on that question of female circumcision and human rights, and why there was this huge disparity with all the information we have about how female circumcision can be bad. Why is it still happening? So I went back to Cairo with the intention of learning more about that, and I worked for a while at a women's rights NGO that was focusing on female circumcision. But what I found is that many of the women who worked at that organization were still intended to circumcise their daughters. And so I didn't understand. And so I would have conversations with them, why, with all the information you have, you work at a women's rights organization, why do you still want to do this? And what I realized is that there's a huge disconnect between the language used by human rights groups and what people experience in their daily lives. And so at a certain point, a link needs to be made between people's real experiences and what the human rights community is saying, right? So after that experience, I decided to go to law school. And a big part of that was because I felt like the law and justice was a big potential part of the solution, to how we could rectify some of these inequalities. So after law school, I got married. I married a South African man. His name is Andrew Constant. and I decided to move to Johannesburg to be with him. While there, I met a woman who's an expert in she's an expert in domestic violence and international law. And she wanted to start an NGO that worked with victims of gender-based violence, right? So that means domestic violence and sexual violence. And a big part of her philosophy was that we can't just react to the problem, we have to think about the system, right? So we have to think about the policemen and the prosecutors in court and how they're behaving towards these women, because that's part of the larger problem. And so I've spent the last 2 years working with her to start this NGO called Lawyers Against Abuse. And in the process of doing that, we've really, in our consultations, been thinking about how can we create sustainable change in the lives of these women so that it's not constantly reactive. Because a lot of the NGO world will react to problems. So a woman comes to you and she's been beaten, and you think, okay, where can I get her medical assistance? Where can I, what court can we go to get a protection order? And so we would do that work as well. But then the larger question is, okay, how can we make sure that this doesn't happen again, right? Or how can we make sure that she doesn't have to come to us, that she can safely go to a police officer and know that she'll be treated appropriately, or that she can safely go to a courthouse and know that she'll be treated appropriately. And that wasn't the case in the neighborhoods we were working in South Africa. So that's what I've been working on for the past few years. My beliefs affect all my decision making, whether it's conscious or not, simply because that's the way that I was raised. But just because of that, I don't think that means that my decisions will remain the same. I think my understanding of my beliefs and my understanding of equality is constantly evolving as I grow up and as I read and as I observe the world. And so right now I might have a certain view that's taking my career in a certain direction, but that could change in 5 years. But I certainly think that this concept of equality is a very intricate one, and I don't think it's an easy one to fully grasp, and it's something we really need to continue to think about as a community and see all the spaces in which equality would shift our behaviors or shift our decision making. I think when it comes to gender or any other kind of quality of human beings that are used as a way to oppress, men have the luxury not to have to always think about gender rights, right? So women, I think, are faced with it on a regular basis. You think about it when you go for a job interview. You're conscious of it when you're thinking about your children and wanting to take maternity leave and if that's going to affect your career. These are just small things, but other issues that face women that are a lot more physically harmful are things like domestic violence or sexual abuse. Women have to think about these things. They're conscious about it when they're walking down the street. When they just in their home alone, right? They're vulnerable in a way that men aren't. And because of that, they can't not think about it. I guess the greatest thing that men can do in this struggle is to be conscious, is to make the choice to think about gender issues on a regular basis. So when they're going through their daily lives, they're thinking, how could this experience that I'm having be improved so that if I were a woman, I would feel whatever. I would feel safe, I would feel comfortable, I would feel accepted, right? So that would, I guess, be the biggest difference. I think women have to think about it and men don't, right? But men can think about this as well, and I think that would change behaviors and it would change decision making as well, if that were a more conscious thought. I think there are many issues that one could list when it comes to women's equality and women's rights around the world. A big one is education. I think access to education is key for women to even have opportunities. If you're not going to allow women to learn in the same way as men, then that automatically shuts that down, right? I think also an inherent belief in women as equals is important to reducing things like domestic violence. I think domestic violence is a huge issue, and I think many women don't report it. And so there are a lot of women who are living in our society today who go home to places where they feel afraid of their partners, right? And that's not fair to them. It's not fair to their children. It also means that they might not have the capacity or the opportunity to do things outside of the home that they might otherwise do because they're in this restricted space. Just imagine the person who you're supposed to love and loves you the most in the world is someone who you might be afraid of harming you, right? Imagine being in that space all the time and how that might affect your the psychology of, of who you are and how you approach the world. So that's very damaging. So I think domestic violence is a big issue, and closely related is sexual violence. So those are big issues that are global, but I also think there are a lot of things that happen that we don't always see as problems or we don't recognize as problems. I think there are more subtle inequalities that can occur. I think expectations around who takes care of the home and who takes care of the children often fall more on the woman. But in a world where we also see women working, that means that oftentimes women have twice the load, right? Because they're working and taking care of the home. And again, that's not very fair, right? So where do we create that balance? And sometimes you see a career woman who has kids and you think, oh, wow, she's got it all. But really, is there equality in that home? Maybe, maybe not. Equality of men and women has come quite a long way in the past, certainly in the past 100 years, and even since my mother's generation, so the past 30 years, I do think that there have been massive gains. But I think there continue to be structural issues that are rooted in larger assumptions about men and women's roles that need to be shifted, or priorities that need to be shifted. I think a big one that a lot of women struggle with is the prioritizing family over work, for example. And if society at large prioritized family and the taking care of children in the way that they should, then perhaps workplaces would be structured in a way to make it easier for women to have both, right? So that's a structural thing that's based in an assumption that's perhaps old and needs to be updated. So I think at the core of all of these problems is a lack of true belief in the oneness of humanity, right? So if you believe that all people are one, then you also have to believe in a high standard of justice, right? And part of that, I think, in the Baha'i writings, it says that we have to view every individual as a trust of the whole. There's a responsibility to every individual to ensure that they receive justice. And that applies to women, and it applies to everyone. And so I think truly believing in that, or the lack of belief in that, is what is at the root of a lot of these problems. So the fact that that all people are equal, and more than that, that we owe a responsibility to every person for them to be able to reach their full capacity. So I think in our society, we often tend to be very self-centered. We think about us, we think about our particular community, our particular group, and we don't always think about people who aren't like us, right? And so that applies, let's say, men not thinking about women. It can apply to, certain individuals not thinking about minority groups, right? But we need to break out of that and start seeing every individual almost as an extension of ourselves, and making sure that they're given all they need to reach their full potential. I think when it comes to all gender equality issues, it comes to a shift in mindset, right, for all individuals involved, men and women, whether they're policymakers or whether they're simply husbands, right? So it requires a shift in how we view women, truly accepting and understanding that women are equal, and valuing what they bring to society. I think if that shift were made, it would drastically decrease, for example, incidents of domestic violence, right? Or sexual violence, if there was truly that true understanding of equality. I think it would change the way offices structure their family leave or maternity leave policies, right? I think it would change the way people view a woman who has chosen to take time off to take care of her children. So I think all of these things could be drastically improved if we have a change in mindset. But a change in mindset can't just happen overnight. That requires work at a community level to truly kind of internalize that view. I think the role of men is first and foremost to recognize that there are certain difficulties that women experience that they don't. So to first recognize that, and then to educate themselves on it, to truly understand, what does this inequality mean for women? How do they experience it? How does it make them feel? So it's that understanding, that empathy, right, for women, that I think can lead to men then making decisions that will further equality, right? To simply say as a man, yes, I know that inequality is a problem, isn't enough, right? I think you truly need to understand it so that your decisions in life can be well informed, and you'll truly be coming from a place of empathy and love and understanding for women. Having said that, probably the easiest place to start is with the women closest to you, right? So your wife, your daughters, your mother, your aunts, whoever it is, women in your life who you interact with on a daily basis, thinking about how your decisions could create better equality within your home, within that space, right? Thinking about how you treat your daughters, the way in which you compliment them. You know, are you focusing more on how beautiful they are, or on how intelligent they are, right? Little things like this that can make a big difference in how your daughter views herself later in life.